Thus far, we've talked at length about activities, content providers, and services. So you might be wondering, what about that mysterious fourth Android component, the broadcast receiver? When things happen on your phone, Android issues special intents known as system broadcast intents. Here are some examples of broadcast intents sent by the system. Looking a little closer, here's one, for example, when a download is complete. And here's another for when the headset is plugged in. If you're creating an app that needs to know about one of these state changes on the phone and then run some code, you're going to be using a broadcast receiver. A broadcast receiver is a core Android component that enables applications to receive intents that are broadcast by the system or by other applications. A broadcast receiver can be triggered even when the app is not running. For example, say that you have an app that needs to change its UI depending on whether the device is online versus offline. A broadcast receiver is what you'd use to be triggered when the change has occurred. You specify which request the receiver is interested in using something known as an intent filter. An intent filter is an expression that says what intents should trigger your component. Intent filters are commonly used in the app's manifest file. It should be noted that intent filters are not specific to broadcast receivers. For example, the first activity in your app always has an intent filter. This intent filter uses the action main and the category launcher, as seen here. This signals that this is the main entry point for your app, and when the launcher starts an intent to launch the app, this is the activity that should be triggered by that intent. If you want to create a broadcast receiver, there are basically two ways to do it, either statically or dynamically. The difference is that static broadcast receivers are triggered whenever the broadcast intent occurs. The receiver will be triggered even if the app is offline. This is opposed to dynamic broadcast receivers, which are tied to the app's lifecycle. Generally, if possible, it's better to create a dynamic broadcast receiver, or to use job scheduling if you can. Relying on static broadcast receivers can be problematic. Let's see why. So if you look at how you statically define a broadcast receiver, it involves registering the receiver in the manifest, and using the XML intent filter tags. For example, this is how you'd statically define a broadcast receiver in the Android manifest, and this would trigger a broadcast receiver called New Picture Broadcast Receiver anytime a new photo is taken. The corresponding New Picture Broadcast Receiver class would look something like this. It would be a class that extends broadcast receiver and implements the onReceived method. OnReceived takes a context and the broadcast intent that triggered the broadcast. Because this is a static broadcast receiver that was defined in the manifest, this broadcast receiver would be triggered whenever a photo was taken, even if your app isn't running. Now this is very powerful, but it's also very easy to abuse. Just think of what would happen if the user had downloaded 10 apps that were all using the new picture taken broadcast. Whenever a new picture was taken, suddenly a bunch of apps would be triggered and the device would slow to a crawl. Because of this, some broadcast intents won't even let you statically define a broadcast receiver. Specifically, intents that have the flag receiver registered only. Specifically, intents that have the flag receiver registered only flag set. So, if you need to execute code when your app isn't running, schedule a job if possible. Jobs have constraints for the most common situations, as we mentioned, such as Wi-Fi and charging, and jobs are set up to be very battery friendly. That said, in some cases, you will need to register a static broadcast receiver. These are usually cases where you need to catch certain specific intents on older devices when the app is not running. But, if you need to listen for system broadcasts when the app is running, dynamic broadcast receivers are your best option. The actual broadcast receiver class for a dynamically registered receiver looks the same, but instead of defining the receiver in the manifest, you register and unregister the receiver during the activity's lifecycle methods. In this case, we're using onResume and onPause. This example is some code that listens for whether the headphones are plugged in. Now in this example, because it's a dynamic broadcast receiver, this listening will only happen when the activity is open and visible. Now that you know a little bit more about broadcast receivers and when to use them, let's add one to your app.